Out of all of the damning revelations to come out of former White House aide Cassidy Hutchinson's testimony Tuesday, one of the most devastating for former President Trump personally is that he allegedly lunged at and assaulted his Secret Service security detail for refusing to drive him to the Capitol after his speech so that the former president could join his supporters there. But the question is, did that really happen? Hutchinson, who was not in the car with the president on January 6, testified that former Trump Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations, Tony Ornato, told her the story about Trump attacking his security detail. But Ornato reportedly disputes this and is said to be willing to testify he never told Hutchinson that Trump grabbed the steering wheel or an agent on his detail. And sources close to or within the Secret Service have told NewsNation and other major news outlets that the agents are prepared to testify that the incident did not happen. Now remember, there was a conversation that was apparently recounted to her by another person, Ornato, who wasn't even present himself. So the most important question that needs to be answered is whether or not Ornato told Hutchinson this.
Tony described him as being irate. The president said something to the effect of, "I'm the effing president, take me up to the Capitol now." To which Bobby responded, "Sir, we have to go back to the West Wing." The president reached up towards the front of the vehicle to grab at the steering wheel. Mr. Trump then used his free hand to lunge towards Bobby Engel. And when Mr. Ornato had recounted this story to me, he had motioned towards his clavicles.
This was a critical moment. And now, as Hutchinson's credibility has been placed into question, it will come down to the credibility of the man who allegedly said it. Hutchinson also said that the agent, who was the target, Bobby Engel, was in the room when Ornato relayed the story. And she says he didn't disagree with or correct any part of what Ornato said. Now, on the one side, there are folks like Fox News host Sean Hannity, who clearly believes Ornato's denial.
Tonight, we're learning that the committee never even one time reached out and did their due diligence to the Secret Service to ever verify that far-fetched claim. And now the two agents involved are prepared, according to every news report pretty much, to testify under oath that the story told yesterday is not true and never happened.
And former Bush White House Press Secretary Ari Fleischer also shared that view.
Sean, this is starting to feel to me like the Steele dossier all over again. A sensational allegation. The press falls for it. They herald the brilliance of the person making the allegation, then it all falls apart. CNN just reported that Tony Ornato, who Cassidy Hutchinson said was her source, he denied telling her, according to CNN, that Donald Trump lunged for the steering wheel. So we already have the person that she said told her this say it's not true.
Now, if Ornato really didn't say what Hutchinson claims, then she just lied under oath. But if he did, in fact, tell Hutchinson this story about Trump lunging, then why would he deny saying it now? Well, some people, including former Trump administration officials, say Ornato shouldn't be taken at his word.
You said you know Tony Ornato, you've tweeted about him. Do you think that he would lie to undermine her testimony?
I think he would lie not under oath. He's not going to perjure himself. I think he's going to come up with a lot of reasons to not testify or comply with the subpoena if he's has that opportunity.
Tony Ornato has said a lot of things didn't happen. He has tried to say to the press and to me indirectly that the clearing of Lafayette Square was not done for President Trump's photo op. Well, that's not true. He was at the center of that.
All right, let's bring in Andrew Sullender, congressional reporter for Axios. He's been covering the January 6th hearings. Thanks a lot for taking the time today. We appreciate it. All right, so do we know anything more generally about Tony Ornato, credibility, reliability, whether he's going to testify?
Sure. So Trump went out on Newsmax in an interview that was aired this morning and basically cast Ornato and Engel as being loyal to him, certainly relative to Hutchinson. And that sort of gives you an indication of where Ornato's reputation falls within former Trump aides. You have Alyssa Farah, who you just played video of. You also have Olivia Troy, who's very out front as a Trump critic now. both coming out and saying that Ornato is not credible, that he often disputes stories that can be proven true. And on the other side, you have Keith Kellogg, somebody who still maintains quite a bit of loyalty to the former president. Trump promoted his book. Kellogg coming out and saying that Ornato is very credible, that he was very professional when he worked with Ornato, and that he would, quote unquote, take his sworn testimony to the bank. So it's clear that this is sort of coming down on which side do you support? Do you believe that Hutchinson's testimony is credible, or do you side with President Trump? Now, there's some important Politico reporting out tonight that sheds a little more light. This likely coming from the committee, that Ornato's testimony wasn't seen as being particularly credible by members of the committee, that he sort of tried to cast Trump in a more sympathetic light than how a lot of other former aides described certain events, such as suggesting that Trump may not have known that Pence was in the Capitol when he tweeted that he did not have the courage to overturn the election, also suggesting that Trump was not fully aware of the situation going on within the Capitol, and that there was nothing more that he could have done to quell the violence. And so what you really have is the committee coming out and sort of coalescing around Hutchinson. You have Kinzinger saying, tweeting very boldly that that Ornato likes to lie. And you have Stephanie Murphy, another member of the committee, saying that his recollection of January 6th is simply not as detailed.
Let me ask you about this. But Ornato has not testified under oath. Do we know that to be a fact?
I don't have reporting to that effect.
Okay. All right. So I would think that the way to solve this would be to have Ornato come, even if he has already testified, maybe he wasn't asked about this specifically, would be to have Ornato come forward and testify under oath. You heard Alyssa Farah there saying she didn't think he would lie under oath. And it seems like that's a fairly straightforward way to do it. Does the committee want to bring him back?
Well, so one important piece there is that while he may have testified under oath, we now know, according to Politico, that and CNN, that he testified in January and in March. It's not clear if he testified about this particular incident.
Right, and he may have just done an interview, right? They may have just talked to him, and he may not have testified under oath, right? So we don't know. Yeah.
And then, compounding that, he also hasn't said publicly on the record that he denies this. We've heard this through intermediaries, through anonymous sources, and we've heard from the Secret Service spokesperson now that he's willing to testify to the committee to that effect, but we haven't seen that done yet. And as many have pointed out, stating a willingness to testify to the January 6th committee in some cases does not amount to an actual willingness to testify. We saw that with Mo Brooks. We saw that with Ginny Thomas.
So we have two levels we need here. Number one, we need the committee to invite him to come testify under oath. And number two, we need him to show up. And so those are two separate questions as to whether those are going to happen. And we shall see. Andrew Sullender, thank you very much for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching. Go to newsnationnow.com to find NewsNation on your cable provider. And don't forget to click the red subscribe button below to get more of NewsNation's fact-driven, unbiased coverage.